Hi everyone, this is new crime story video. So don't waste the time. Let's go.
Hello everyone, my name is David. Today we are going to take a look at another real story with you. Usually you never come across a case where 3 different courts in the country deliver the same verdict, and then the highest court, the Supreme Court, also upholds that decision, only to later overturn its own ruling. This story isn't just about contradictory court judgments, it's also about the police officers who, in a way, murdered the case itself. The 6 people who were sentenced to death lived under constant fear for 13 years, never knowing when the death warrant would arrive at the prison, and the next morning would be their last. Later, in interviews, 1 or 2 of them said that after the Supreme Court confirmed their death sentence, every night they went to sleep, it felt like it could be their last. They felt as if a python was sitting on their chest, heavy and terrifying, and they were helpless, not knowing when it would strike. For years they slept with that crushing weight on their chest, never knowing when death might come knocking. That fear of death had already taken their lives from them. Imagine for 13 long years they lived under that shadow of fear, uncertain of what the next morning would bring. This story dates back to 2003. On June 5th, near Nashik in Maharashtra, 5 members of a family were murdered. The family was extremely poor. There were 7 members in total, and 5 of them were killed in a single night. Only 2 survived. Among the survivors were an elderly mother and her son. The murder happened at night. The killers looted the house, taking cash and some jewelry before fleeing. 5 people had been murdered in a single house. Chaos erupted. The police team arrived. Even officers from the district came. The news was all over the newspapers. The investigation began, and the first thing the police asked was whether anyone had seen the killers because there were 2 living witnesses in that house, the mother and her son. The mother and son said that about 7 to 8 men had come, armed with knives and sticks. They attacked everyone, looted the house, and then left. That's all they had seen. When asked if they could recognize the faces, the son said yes, and the mother confirmed it too. They said the attackers had come right in front of them and hadn't even covered their faces. The police felt confident it seemed like the case would be easy to solve. They began the investigation, but days went by and no clues turned up. Then a senior police officer came up with a plan. He said, make a list of all the wanted criminals or known bad characters around Nashik, anyone with a record, and collect their photographs. So they gathered pictures of all such individuals within roughly a 100-kilometer radius of Nashik. Photos of all those criminals were collected, and then the mother and son were called in. They were told, look at these pictures carefully. The police had prepared an album. It contained photos of known criminals, murderers, thieves, and goons, all from the jurisdiction where the crime had taken place. The mother and son spent hours going through the album, flipping through the pages, carefully studying each face. Slowly, they identified 4 individuals from the photos and said, these are the 4 who came that night and committed the murders. The remarkable part was that not only did the mother identify the same 4 men, the son also picked out exactly the same ones. They said, these were the ones who came, and there were 2 or 3 others with them, but from the photos they only identified 4 people. The police felt they had cracked the case, but surprisingly, they didn't arrest any of those 4 men. Why? That remains unknown even today. Time passed, and still, no arrests were being made in the case. Pressure started mounting on the police. Then, about 10 days later, the police suddenly told the media that they had solved the case of the mass murder of 5 people, and that they had arrested 6 individuals in connection with it. And these were the 6 people the police claimed had gone to that house that night. Not 7 or 8, but exactly 6. Their names were Ambadas Laxman Shinde, Bapu Appa Shinde, Ankush Maruti Shinde, Raja Abba Shinde, Raju Maha Shinde, and Suresh Nagu Shinde. All of them were between 17 and 30 years old. The police said, we've solved the case. Then they took these 6 men to the mother and son and asked, out of these 6, identify the ones who came to your house that night and committed murders. And here's where it got surprising. The surprising part was this. The mother and son identified all 6 of the men and said, yes, these are the ones. They were the only 2 eyewitnesses, the only 2 survivors who had witnessed the murder of 5 family members. And now they confirmed that the 6 men brought in by the police were the killers. That made the police's job easy. They locked them up and started preparing the charge sheet. But here's the shocking twist. The police had earlier created their own photo album, from which the same mother and son had identified 4 different people just a few days earlier. And now these 6 men who were arrested, none of them were among those 4 originally identified. Those 4 were completely different people, and these 6 were entirely different. Another shocking detail was this. The photo album that the police had given earlier contained criminals who lived within a 100-kilometer radius of the crime scene. But the 6 people the police later arrested and claimed had solved the case they lived 300 kilometers away. They came from poor families and survived by doing daily wage labor. So now, the police arrested 6 men from 300 kilometers away and claimed they were the killers, while the 4 people initially identified by the mother and son were completely dropped from the case. They were never arrested, and their names never appeared in any file or charge sheet. This was a case of 5 murders, a serious and brutal crime, and it demanded the harshest punishment. After that, the case went to court. When it first reached the Sessions Court, the court delivered its verdict, and just as expected, the outcome matched what many had feared. The murders had taken place on June 5th, 2003, and the trial went on for the next 3 years. In June 2006, the Pune District Court, the lower court, delivered its judgment and sentenced all 6 men to death. Death penalty hanging. All 6 kept saying they were innocent, that they had nothing to do with the crime, but no one listened. The court sentenced all 6 to death. After that, the 6 men challenged the verdict in the Bombay High Court. The case went to the High Court, and within about 9 months, the Bombay High Court delivered its judgment. In March 2007, the Bombay High Court gave its decision stating that out of the 6 men, 3 were the most brutal, so their death sentences would be upheld. But for the remaining 3, since their role was considered to be less serious, their punishment was reduced to life imprisonment. So, the lower court had sentenced all 6 to death, but the Bombay High Court upheld the death penalty for only 3, and commuted the sentence of the other 3 to life imprisonment. Now, all 6 of them took the case to the Supreme Court, and the case continued in the Supreme Court for 2 years. In April 2009, the Supreme Court delivered a historic verdict. It stated that the murder of 5 people fell under the rarest of the rare category, and therefore there was no scope for mercy or sentence reduction for the killers. The Supreme Court said the Bombay High Court was wrong in commuting the death sentence of 3 of the convicts to life imprisonment. It ruled that all 6 were deserving of the death penalty, so the lower court had sentenced all 6 to death. The Bombay High Court had upheld the death penalty for 3 and reduced it to life imprisonment for the other 3. But when the case reached the Supreme Court, it once again sentenced all 6 to death. At this point, all 6 men had lost hope. Death felt closer than ever, and each day in prison weighed heavily on them. They often said it felt like a python was lying on their chest, ready to strike at any moment and end their lives. They lived each day in the shadow of fear. That's when an NGO in Mumbai learned about their case, an organization that provides legal aid. These 6 men were extremely poor. The NGO began studying the case, and as they dug deeper, they were shocked by what they found. After that, they decided to challenge the Supreme Court's verdict. They decided to challenge the verdict in the same court, the Supreme Court. So they returned to the Supreme Court and argued that the 2009 judgment sentencing all 6 of them to death was wrong because they were innocent. The Supreme Court admitted the review petition and agreed to reopen the case for a fresh hearing. But while the death sentence had been handed out swiftly by all 3 courts, the review of whether the sentence was even justified took years. By now, they had already spent many years in prison since 2003. 6 years passed until 2009, and from then until 2018, all they received was the death sentence hanging over them. Then in 2018, the Supreme Court finally said, okay, we will accept the review petition. 15 years had already gone by with no certainty of whether they would live or die. From 2018, the Supreme Court began fresh hearings on the case. And then came March 2019, a historic month in the history of the Supreme Court. It delivered a landmark verdict, one that raised serious questions about the police investigation, the legal process, and the decisions of the lower courts. When the Supreme Court allowed a review of its own previous judgment, a 3-judge bench was formed. The entire case and every piece of evidence were heard again, this time thoroughly and in detail. And for the first time, it became clear how the case itself had been mishandled back in 2003. One of the key revelations was this. The 4 men initially identified by the mother and son, the only 2 eyewitnesses, were never mentioned again. These 4 had been named by the victims right after the crime, and the police themselves had taken a photo album containing pictures of known wanted criminals. Those 4 were listed in that official album. Yet, when the lower court, high court, and even the Supreme Court initially gave their judgments and handed down death sentences, those original 4 suspects and the eyewitness testimony identifying them were never mentioned at all. Now think about this in a case where there were only 2 eyewitnesses, and they both clearly identified 4 people. Those 4 photos, those 4 criminals, were never arrested, never brought to court, and never mentioned in any charge sheet. The families were told something entirely different. The Supreme Court found this extremely suspicious. Then the court asked, how exactly did these 6 men come into the picture? And what they found next was even more disturbing. The murders took place on June 5th, 2003, but these 6 men were living 300 kilometers away with their families at the time. When their backgrounds were investigated, it was found that they lived in such extreme poverty that they could barely afford daily meals. Their wages were so low that even thinking about traveling outside their village was unimaginable. They lived hand to mouth if they left home for a day. They wouldn't even know if there'd be food left for their families. They had never left their region, not even once. Dozens of people from their locality were ready to testify that these men never traveled anywhere, and this was even stated in court. But during the lower court hearings, that evidence was never properly considered. Now think about it. If someone has never even left their hometown, and there are multiple witnesses to prove that, how could they travel 300 kilometers, commit a murder on June 5th, 2003, and then return unnoticed? It simply wasn't possible. They didn't have the means to do it. To travel 300 kilometers, one would need at least a bus or a train. They couldn't have taken a cab or a private car with the little money they had. The court realized that at the time of the murders, these men were in their village. Another key point. According to the police and the mother-son eyewitnesses, some gold items and cash were stolen from the house during the crime. Yet not a single stolen item was ever recovered from these 6 men. Despite that, they were simply picked up, thrown into jail, and declared guilty. The families were called in and told, these are the culprits. But if they truly were the killers, there should have been some evidence recovered, something to connect them to the crime. But there was nothing. Then the truth started to come out. When the mother and son were asked, how did you identify these 6 men? Why did you first identify those 4? Were they wrong? And these 6, are you sure they were right? They said, it was dark that night, but we clearly remember the faces of those 4 men. We think it was them. Then they were asked, so how did you identify these 6? They replied, the police told us they had found the real killers. They said, we've caught them. So when the police came and said it with such confidence and authority, we believed them. They added, anyway, when there's so much fear, so much death in the house, who remembers exact details like eye color, the shape of the nose, what kind of face, what hairstyle? We were too scared for our own lives to notice all that. We just wanted to survive. The mother and son even said, when the police told us these are the ones, we trusted them. But in truth, we never saw their faces clearly. When all of this was laid out in front of the Supreme Court starting in 2018, the false identifications, the coerced statements, and the lack of any evidence, the court summoned the police officers involved in the investigation. Then the police were questioned. It was revealed that they had closed the case just for the sake of showing it was solved. But even then, one mystery remained. Why didn't they arrest the 4 men whose photos they had shown in the album, and who were identified by the eyewitnesses? What was the problem? Why were they never arrested? When all of this came to light, the Supreme Court said that a grave injustice had been done. These 6 men had spent around 16 years behind bars, living every single day under the shadow of death. Every day was worse than dying. They had suffered immense injustice and cruelty, and all of it was because of police misconduct. The court said, we can't undo what has been done, but what we can do is release these men because that is the only justice now. In March 2019, the Supreme Court reversed its own earlier judgment, the one that had sentenced all 6 to death. All 6 were fully acquitted. Not just acquitted, the court also ordered the Maharashtra government to compensate each of them with 500k and to support them financially. The court acknowledged that after spending 16 years in jail, their lives had been completely uprooted, jobs lost, families broken. The world had moved on without them. So until they found a stable job or livelihood, the state was ordered to give each of them a monthly allowance of 2.6k to help them rebuild their lives. This wasn't just money, this was their life being given back after 16 years. When they finally returned home, it was like starting a new life. But it wasn't easy. Many of their parents had passed away, their children had grown up, homes had been burned down. Some were living in tin sheds and society still saw them with suspicion. No one wanted to come near them because of the stigma. That's a killer's child, that's a murderer's wife, that's a murderer's father or mother. No one would give them a job, not even daily wage work. They were just surviving, not really living. When they came back home, they struggled immensely to restart their lives from scratch. Among them were 2 real brothers, and slowly, with great difficulty, they all tried to rebuild. Thankfully, there are still some good people and some NGOs in the world who stepped in and helped bring their lives back on track. Now, they are finally living a new life with their families. But the other side of the story is this. On June 5th, 2003, 5 people were brutally murdered, and the real killer is still free, somewhere out there. And it's very possible that today that person is sitting far away, watching everything and laughing at the police and the justice system. This is the reality of law. This is the reality of police. So this was today's story. Thank you for joining us on this journey today.
Oh, this is a new crime story. So I hope like this. So like the video and don't forget to subscribe. Bye bye.